I am John Henry. I am from Manchester Metropolitan University, and very much thank you for having me here today in the FairPlay Network. A little more about me is aside of being a senior lecturer at Manchester Met, I'm also the program leader of the games design course there. So I do tend to sort of be a mix between the research and the teaching that I do. But part of the things that I am researching there is into wearable technology, which I know there's some colleagues over in Tampere University doing similar research. Some gamification approaches for sustainability, mental well-being. We've got a fairly mature project on that. Social media and esports, and also many other projects that I'm, starting to lose track of. Other things that I do, because I'm not busy enough, is I lead a games science lab. So I come from the Department of Computing in the institution, so I'm very much a computer scientist underneath everything, and so are the colleagues within that lab. So we very much have that sort of development angle on things that we do, and we think a lot about human-computer interaction. We have a little site there, but as I say, it's not the best. And then outside of that, we also have a cross-faculty games centre at Manchester Metropolitan University that brings everyone across the institution that's interested on games approaches together. And I lead a little theme there on games for health as well. But that's far too much about me. More importantly, the research. So the research here, the things that I want to touch on, a little bit more about the background research, is this idea of combining the Internet of Things, which I'm sure you've heard of, that terminology, but if not, just a little thing, it's not Internet connected, so it's not just the ability for you to turn on your thermostat from your phone, for example, but it's this ability for devices to talk to one another and work around the person in the middle. So back in 2015, research started coming out, and they were using this term of smart serious games. It didn't really take off, but it was this idea of how can we combine everything together, think about sensor data that the person themselves is creating and manipulating, but also sensor data from their wider network, like, say, for example, traffic data, weather data, things like this, that is potentially having an impact on the person. And then we're thinking about this concept as well of synchronous, so immediate gameplay and feedback loop, and asynchronous, how all that can be, for example, calculated and presented the next day. A subgroup of all that is, in that serious games realm, is exergames, or games for exercise. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you in the room, have heard about this concept. It's not necessarily a new idea, but the idea of how can we really change behavior. And I think perhaps as I move forward with this presentation, that's the thing here that I'm going to tie in that though a lot of my talk is going to be on healthcare applications, the underlying pedagogy element there is that change of behavior. So there are very much commercial products that have done this that are not necessarily research-based, and I actually want to highlight that as a strength that really shows the idea of how, I think colleagues have already mentioned this, how people can essentially stumble on these types of games without necessarily starting from a serious goal. Potentially, though, the problem around this is even with this use of technology, you're not always able to meet a very specific serious goal. So you can meet a very broad goal, move your body in some sort of way, try and burn some sort of calories. But it can be much more specific if you're trying to get to a marginalized community or a very targeted specific audience to use something like this. Now, before we move on to the specifics of the project I'm talking about, one of the things that I did through my PhD and then continued working on was this idea of how can you really directly embed Internet of Things and sensors into serious games and games in general. And it really underlines, from a development perspective, all the principles that come together in the sense of how you can use the networking protocols, the coding, if you like, that has to happen, and the processing of the data to make one cohesive game. And I'm not going to bore you too much on those things. If you are interested, we can have a chat later, and I can show you my research. But what I really want to get to here is this idea of then really sensors and games. The fact that sensors now, from when I started on my research journey in 2015, they're far more accessible than they used to be. Nearly everybody has got sensors on them, on their smartphones, on their watches, and so on and so forth. And in reality, all of this data that's coming from these sensors provides so much information about who people are, but also the environments that they're in. And what we can do is lean on previous concepts like adaptive games or dynamic games, games that change, and empower them or even create new game experiences by leaning on these sensors. And I can say from the conferences I've been to, different research and colleagues I've experienced, we're starting to see a positive shift moving from sensors that are there to read player data and then do a post-analysis and maybe write a paper on it, to actually sensors informing and having a direct effect to gameplay, which is really exciting. So then the other question that we have is, how do we avoid overwhelming people with technology? One of the things I believe in strongly is minimal viable technology. So how is it possible to create what I want to create with the games that I need, the game experiences, without just adding a ton of technology in there because technology is cool, even though I think technology is cool. It might not be that the players think so. So wearable technology, off-the-shelf technology, really easy to encourage people to then get on board with the game experience. Really affordable, you're not asking sometimes for people to even buy anything different. And then one of the things that's now changed since this slide is we've got another paper out on wearable technology and how feasible it is in its broader sense, particularly using the case study that we have with a Fitbit. Now, talking a little bit more about that case study, there's a game we developed called Cardia, which is Greek for heart. I'm not very imaginative. And it's a very simple principle. It's just saying that you're using your heart as the only game input for a game. And that was really critical because we wanted a game that had no tutorial, that had no means of you having to try and figure out what was going on, and that was really, really intuitive. So what we did was we used a Fitbit and a smartphone, essentially, again, really easy technology. And then from there, all we do is connect the data that we're receiving in near real time to the game to be able to control it. We created a very simple interface as well for the proof of concept, something that we felt if you were to bring out for STEM. So in the UK, we have British Science Week, where we try and encourage younger children to think about science as a potential avenue for their future careers. So this was very much used in that context as well to help people just have fun and see what can, if you like, if it can inspire people in the right way. The principles of the gameplay is simple. You're trying to move away from this slime monster, so you want your heart rate to be elevated, and you're provided with visual feedback so that you can feel that sense of control during the gameplay. And then you're also seeing that motivation come through quite naturally. What we did then to make sure that the science, if you like, behind it and technology behind it was valid, we then performed some experiments across Coventry University and Manchester Metropolitan University to see how well the Fitbit was reading compared to medical grade equipment like the Polar H10, which is what we used in our experiments. And then what we saw, and here's where you can see my computer science background, is us doing some correlations between the two. There was a time lag, some of which was down to the implementation of the game. However, perhaps the most promising thing there is the similarity that you can see between those two sensors. So here you see you've got the Kendall-Tor-Spearman correlation. Again, similarity is of a respectable range. So all that's essentially showing you is that the fact that the Unity game that we used with the Fitbit was very much recording at lower range, it was still having a sufficient trend that's shown that the heart rate is very much similar. But what we did see is as I mentioned, just the heart rate mean, so the average heart rate was constantly being recorded lower compared to the medical grade equipment. And that's, excuse me, that is actually quite a critical point, because what that does tell you is that while you can use off-the-shelf technology and really try and create something that's really accessible, you have to, as games designers, be aware of the limitations of the technology. So what we wouldn't necessarily, and we don't, recommend is that you would use this for a very specific, if you like, medical intervention. What this should be used for, and this type of off-the-shelf technology should be used for, though, is still for things that allow for crude measurements. So, God damn it. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. So when I say crude measurements, if, for example, you look at the legal notices on any wearable like Apple Watch, essentially what they say there is they recognize the fact that these watches are not giving you medical grade readings, but that they are sufficient enough to get some kind of an understanding. So now as a game designer, it's saying, okay, we can work around that, we know that that's the case, but how can we then say something that's close enough to the heart rate, we saw the trend is good enough, how can that still be used to make something really super meaningful? Now, aside of the technology, of course, we wanted to see what the perception of the people playing the game were, which is really important to say that there's really meaning in doing these type of things. We saw that, as we were hoping, the usability, picking up the game was super, super simple. Everybody found that really easy. They saw that the fun ranged from the most positive ranges, although we did have some people that did not necessarily find it fun. And then the free text said that they felt it was more childish, which makes sense. But then when it comes to the adoption, the idea of taking this and using this and doing something similar again, that was a really, really super positive response from the people that took part in the experiments. Because of our future research ambitions, which I will talk to you about, we also quizzed on the age range that we thought this type of showcase or experience could be used. And we saw that a lot of people were slightly skeptical about using this in children, but then in other ages above that children age, people were quite positive, which is quite an interesting insight in the sense of even though the graphics were quite oriented towards children, the participants still felt a bit apprehensive. We assume, potentially correctly, that it's that use of technology and heart rate that puts people off in that perception of it. So, we were interested to see in those different game elements. We found that the different game elements were very much positively received, which we're pleased about, and that the hardware and the concept very much is positively received, but there's still a lot more that we can do, which is what we were expecting given the stage of the research that we're on. So here, just to fairly summarize this quite quickly, you can see as again the game elements, the particular game things we've shown there, how well they were received, and going on to the sort of juicy stuff, what we're doing next. So what we have done is we've worked with Coventry University, we've created some workshops on how we can use this type of idea in different ways. There's a paper coming out on that, on mapping all those responses there. There's a PhD student I have recruited that's looking into how you can use something similar for motor skill competency in younger children, so how can you do that? And that's being co-designed with primary school educators so that we are thinking about the challenges and the environments that they're working in and how to do it in its best form. And then there's a ton of different other side projects going on, including dance and many other things that I won't necessarily bore you with because I'm running out of time as well here today. But definitely what I want to highlight, as I say, going back to it, is this idea of wearable technology and other sensors in games, how very much there's a real positive thing there to be continuing investigation on. And something that we can think about as well for this particular network is how that could be used as well in educational contexts. And then again, thinking about this use of wearable technology not only as a sensor, but also as an actuator. That's something that our particular case study doesn't investigate. But it's worthwhile remembering that, for example, you can trigger haptics and things like that from that wearable watch. That might be something that's really useful for you to do as well. There's a little bit of time there for a sort of discussion and stuff, but the other thing I wanted to note before my time runs out is that there will be opportunity to play the game as well, as we mentioned over the dinner time. So I've got the things with me, and you can have a go if you wish to burn some calories. That was it. That's me, really. Thank you for your time. Yes, at the back. I think this.
Microphone.
Thank you so much for also showcasing such a serious game. I'm curious mostly about the part with children, because I think 8 years ago I tried to develop an embodied training for primary school children,
Okay.
for dyslexic children, but it failed because we had no readily available general purpose, cheap, wearable solutions that were open data, so I had to write a firmware myself to accept the data. So I'm curious, what is the current state of wearable devices accessible for children, cheap, that then can be used in game-based learning, extra games, embodied trainings, whatever?
Yeah, no, it's much, much better now. So one of the things that the game does include is this third-party software that we've not developed called HyperRate. We're happy to say, HyperRate is what allows you to do is use essentially any wearable device and then plug that into a game. But we are still not necessarily saying use it for research and data collection, which is what you were saying before, because we're not sure what the company is doing with the data. So there's a big ethical consideration for you to have there. So instead what we're saying is as a play tool, as something to prototype and things like that, by all means, you can also use this company called HyperRate. I am not affiliated with them. This is not an ad. But the other thing, going back on this cheap technology, absolutely, now there's a lot of available cheap technology. And in essence, there's a lot of different ways that you can go around those technical challenges. So what you saw there, I produced the software architecture, if you like, well, the hardware system architecture. That's showing you that I go from watch to phone, and then that's a Bluetooth connection, then from phone over internet connection. But realistically, if you're working with a lower-end device and you are happy to say that the educators and everything in the same room can work with a laptop, say, for example, then you could, providing that you don't want to do a class of 30, 40 students, you could link up the Bluetooth directly to the laptop and then just go get the data straight from there and then put that into a game. And that's much cheaper, much easier to some extent if you're using low-cost devices. So the answer is absolutely. And if you're interested to work on stuff like that, then yeah, I'm all ears. And yeah, as you can tell, I like taking on many projects. It's my biggest flaw. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
I think I might be loud enough, if you can hear me. So I've also worked with a lot of these medical devices and technology, and one of the problems, like in the past, of course, is we developed this stuff with a lot of lack of representation bias.
Yeah.
I have a lot of readings that you try and use this stuff in also places like Holiday County or whether it's Makoeni for medical applications that you had real problems with them.
Yes.
Have you seen massive improvement with this type of stuff?
No.
Yeah.
That's the main honest answer. No. So the problem is still with the wearable technology is that fundamentally, to go computery on you again, it's using light. And then that light reacts differently to different skin pigment. So because the fundamental technology has not changed, though there has been advancements with things like machine learning algorithms, etc., to try and mitigate the thing, which is improving, there's still, the latest studies I've read on trying to essentially get rid of that is still not necessarily there. There's still no wearable device that is able to have no differentiation based on skin pigment. So you're absolutely right, which is why one of the things that I'm saying as a game designer is instead of us saying, oh, okay, that sucks, or okay, we can't do that, what really we should be doing is say, we know what the limitation is. So if we need to then, in our game, accept that limitation and then adjust the game so that it's not hindering the player, then as games makers, we should do that. That's absolutely fine. So if I know that based on skin pigment, I need to have a different variance because the technology sucks, that's okay, and I can get around that, and that's fine. So it's still about thinking about how we can adjust those values, which is why there's that middleware, if you like, area of technology that's required. So you to say, then that's okay, and now I can come up with a perfectly fine game.
Thank you very much. A quick question about how to probably use heart rate for, let's say, more variation. Think about that maybe there are positions in the game or where you have to lower your heart rate or keep a specific heart rate to balance somewhere.
Yeah.
So it would not only go to, let's say, let's kick it to the max, but also like, okay, part about their own body.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent suggestion. Absolutely. So what I haven't mentioned is, and when you play the game, you'll see is I have still not lent on decreasing your heart rate, but there is a bit where aside of you sort of just doing what you want, you're being recorded for sort of 10 seconds-ish, and then that gets converted into jump. So then you have to really try and sprint to create a jump. So there's absolutely different ways you can use that mechanic, and it doesn't have to be that one-to-one relationship of speed higher. You can do it the other way as well. So as you say, if you're thinking about training, and the aim of the game is actually that you have to keep cool, it could be that the opposite. You do much better because your heart rate's lower and things like that. So yeah, there's no problem there.